law is very easy to unzip because there actually isn't much to it. Just to summarize again, at the risk of being boring and repeating myself, we have our species, we have biological traits, we have a sense that not one or other of these is essential to who we are. And then we have the more normative inquiry about personhood, in ethics at least. Morning. And there, for a variety of reasons, and it's a little bit difficult to figure out exactly why historically, there is this preference, and it's actually a preference in pretty much every culture around the world. It's not peculiar to, let's say, the West, that what we tend to value, what we tend to prioritize, is a capacity to stand outside yourself, to reflect on yourself, to become self-conscious, self-aware, to see yourself in the time-space continuum, to project forward into the future and have some aspirations, ambitions, goals, or wants, no matter how small, no matter how big, so that they're yours, they're not mine, or they're not somebody else's. And maybe overlayered into that, a capacity to rationally process the information, rationally sift your choices, rationally make your own calculations as to what's good for you, what's bad for you, to try and project the natural and probable consequences of your actions. Although I always say to students, if that were the true test, would anybody ever get married, right? And then to be able to rationally communicate your preferences and choices to the world. But when push comes to shove, it's the first set of criteria that most cultures value the most. Your capacity for self-awareness, your capacity to project forward into the future, which of course presumes some modicum of a stable identity, which is formed through social interaction in your early experiences in life and carried forward and so forth. Like I say, it's very unusual to have you presenting one day as one person, another day as another. There's some sense of stability in all of us, although we do morph and change over time. So along comes the technology that now offers us the possibility of playing around with all of these indices, augmenting some, turning others down, enhancing certain abilities, maybe turning off other predispositions and so forth. And it's a logical move forward because we have within our grasp command of the technology to change our nature, but it doesn't quite fit particularly received understandings of norms like autonomy, dignity, liberty, and so forth. Why? It's very interesting, and it's kind of schizoid. On the one hand, our legal cultures really value human autonomy and individual moral agency. To a certain extent, they'll valorize the group identity like family and tribe or caste here in India. But when push comes to shove, it's really the moral agency of the individual that lies at the heart of our legal order. And we'll get to why later on, okay? So you would have said, because it's committed to this idea that it should be committed to your choice regardless which way you exercise your choice. In other words, our legal system is one that values the right and not the good. And just to peel that away, because it's a highfalutin term in philosophy, what it basically means is you decide for yourself what your own ends are and you pursue them. And there is no objective yardstick out there by which to measure your personal choices. Obviously, some modicum of the harm principle kicks in such that if you damage or injure somebody else's prospects, then there's a natural limit imposed, and so on and so forth. But the 64 million rupee question is, does the state, does the political community, does the moral community have a right to intrude to say it's because we value your autonomy that we feel entitled to intrude for other reasons? So for example, and here's where the stark choice is, you may autonomously decide to be upgraded, right? Yet those who operationalize some of these treaties And many governments would say, there's too many risks, there's too many dangers, there's social concerns in play. And for that reason, valuing autonomy to us means not allowing you the choice to actually upgrade yourself, at least at will. Okay? So there's two different versions of autonomy at play. One that's highly instrumental, one that's highly individualistic, one that insists that there's no independent yardstick by how to measure your choices or whether to measure your choices. In which case, you want to be emotionally happy, be our guest. If you want to turn off your emotions, be our guest. If you want to become much, much smarter than the rest of people in your class, be our guest, so long as you can afford the relevant pharmaceuticals and all the rest of it. So you'll find that the treaties embed the second category of autonomy, meaning that it's because we're interested in your autonomy that we're not allowing these technologies to go forward. Even though you, of course, would say, no, it's because I want to exercise my autonomy that I want these interests to move forward. So a very, very interesting tension within notions of autonomy at play in law. And I guess one of the big issues for you to decide as future regulators, future government ministers, future judges is which concept of autonomy is the one that you actually want to privilege and prioritize. And that's totally up to you. There isn't a straightforward legal answer to that. There probably isn't a straightforward philosophical answer to that. Probably comes down to where you're at in your culture at a particular point in time. So, and I have a neat exercise to give you, by the way. This is the UNESCO website, the bioethics division in UNESCO. Very, very rich in information, ideas. And the Council of Europe is kind of like the mirror image of UNESCO. They are both extremely active on bioethics issues. By the way, if you go onto the bioethics website of the Council of Europe, one of the things they'll give you is a précis, a briefing on the jurisprudence of the European Court of Human Rights on bioethics issues. And largely that case law comes down to issues of consent, the quality of the consent, whether it was adequately obtained and given, and so on and so forth. So UNESCO is really interesting on many different levels, but they've produced two declarations in this particular field, and they're pretty straightforward. The first one is the Universal Declaration on the Human Genome in 1997. So the timing fits, because it was in the 90s that the Human Genome Project was underway, that the mapping of the human genes was underway, and ethical concerns, of course, arose, and these were taken up domestically, particularly in the US, but also internationally at the level of UNESCO. One thing, I mean, it's a very interesting document, and you'll read it, and it pronounces very bland preferences for things like privacy, dignity, and autonomy. But of course, it doesn't tell you what spin it's putting on these things. And it leaves out entirely the prospect of gene editing. So although it prohibits genetic cloning of human beings, it doesn't actually get to the issue that we're looking at, which is manipulating your genetic makeup to express one genetic predisposition one way or depress one genetic disposition another way. So very, very interesting in terms of the headline norms, which are the norms you would come to expect: dignity, privacy, autonomy, and so forth. But it doesn't reach the kind of substantive issue that we want to reach. The Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights, again, these have no legal standing. These are not treaties, right? You might say to the extent to which state practice follows suit, it becomes part of customary international law, but I'm not so sure there is universal state practice around the world today, as witness the baby with 3 genetic parents in Mexico only 2 or 3 weeks ago, okay? So, again, what's interesting about it is there is a provision on future generations, which is quite interesting. I'll read it to you. It's Article 16. Okay. Protection of future generations. The impact of life sciences on future generations including their genetic constitution, should be given due regard. What does that mean? It could, at one interpretation, mean no genetic manipulation that leads to any impact whatsoever for future generations. But on the other hand, it just says should be given due regard. But what does that mean? Does that mean that if the balance of risks is such that you can absolutely, completely, totally minimize the risks that future generations will go rogue, so to speak, genetically speaking, that the individual's autonomy rights are at their maximum? Or does it mean that if the risk to future generations is unknown and unknowable, according to today's science, that the autonomy rights of the individual likewise are reduced, a kind of a sliding scale in the calculus of risks? We don't know, because no issue has arisen under that, and there is no complaints procedure under this particular declaration. So I just give them to you because they pronounce headline norms, but that just creates interpretive difficulties and problems, both in understanding really what autonomy means and also in understanding the limits of state power in regulating the particular sphere. Flash forward to my part of the world, Europe, and you probably know the difference between the European Union and the Council of Europe, right? Right? Okay, so the Council of Europe is, and this is one of its weaknesses, it's primarily an intergovernmental body, right? So everything is done behind closed doors, government to government. Civil society you rarely have a look in. At the end of the day, it's the interests of governments that predominate. Okay, they like to say that it's more transcendent than that, but at the end of the day, it's the interests of governments that predominate. There's a series of conventions within the biomedicine sphere of the Council of Europe, and Council of Europe's DNA, if I can put it that way, and misuse the phrases, human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. They see these three things as connected, although in reality they can be quite distinct concepts and they can even work against one another. So a lot of the operational wings of the Council of Europe that operationalize intergovernmental activities on various topics, they take their cues from the European Convention of Human Rights, and particularly from the case law of the European Court of Human Rights. And taking that cue then, several treaties, legally binding treaties, were concluded within the auspices of the Council of Europe, which, by the way, are open to non-European states. So, for example, Mexico, Israel, even the United States, I think Japan, but all have consultative status and usually sign into many of these treaties. So it's theoretically open to India, for example, to ratify one of these conventions. The most famous of which is the Biomedicine Convention of 1997, called the Oviedo Convention, after the city in Portugal where it was concluded. Very, very interesting piece of treaty making, if you want. The Biomedicine Convention outlaws human cloning, but it says nothing about genetic editing, right? So straightforward human cloning is outlawed. Of course, that's assuming that your state ratifies and then domesticates and then implements the provisions of the convention itself. There's another website in the Council of Europe called the Treaty website. And there you can track all of the treaties, all of the ratifications, all of the signatures, and all of the reservations. By the way, my country hasn't ratified this, apparently because, and I've never been able to figure this out, because of its potential reach to the issue of abortion, which was, at least in the past, quite controversial in my country, isn't so much now in the present. It also interestingly reaches the issue of genetic information, and announces a rule of non-discrimination with respect to genetic information. So an employer can't abuse your genetic history to exclude you from the workplace, and so on and so forth. It's one of the first, it is the first treaty in the world to explicitly do that. Okay. I'm sorry, I misspoke. It does regulate intervention in the human gene, and it allows for genetic editing for prevention, diagnostic, or therapeutic purposes, and only if its aim is not to introduce a modification in the genome of any descents, any future people. Sorry, I misspoke. It does reach the issue, which undermines the whole trajectory of transhumanism, because the whole point there is that you can genetically edit, and that those edits will actually carry forward into succeeding generations. In other words, it bumps up against an individualistic understanding of autonomy rights. Why can't I do this? Okay, it is future generations, but after all, I can drink alcohol, which is going to affect future generations while I'm carrying a baby. Why can't I exercise similar autonomy rights in this regard? So, very interesting provisions. And the other protocols, touchscreen, how cool is that? The other protocols reach issues like genetic testing, obviously, and cloning. So I'll let you read it for yourself. But the thing is, the general principles of autonomy, dignity, privacy are really not explained. And although genetic editing is covered, none of the other enhancements are actually covered, even implicitly, by these treaties, I would argue, at least. So then I hope you had a chance to have a look at the Kaiser report, the Strandon-Kaiser report, which is the first one of those Council of Europe reports that I mentioned. And it's really, really, really interesting when you read that report and other reports, how they focus on individualistic interests, but they also focus on more systems interests, right? And they use words like our European democratic life as code word for something else that countervails the individual autonomy interests in pursuing what it is they wish to pursue. That is very, very fascinating in these documents, and let's come to that momentarily. It's really all about, there's a certain image of the person, and only that image of the person, that fits with our conception of a liberal democracy. So if we want our liberal democracies to succeed and to project themselves into the future, we've got to preserve that particular image of the person. So anything that potentially interferes with it, dilutes it, or even exaggerates it, is automatically suspect. So we're not looking at it through the lens of autonomy or individual rights. We're really looking at it through the lens of the fit with a particular kind of a person, with a particular kind of political system, which is the liberal democratic political system. Take, for example, the privacy issue. There's a folk memory in Europe, which undoubtedly you don't have, right, of the Nazi system. Pretty much the whole Council of Europe system is built in reaction to the Nazi system. And it's built to try and prevent the slide toward totalitarianism into the future. One of the things the Nazis very cleverly did, very, very cleverly did, and by the way, they always pursued the tactic of legality. Everything was done legally, at least ostensibly. Now, I know that depends on your definition of law and some profound jurisprudential issues, but at least at first face value, it was done legally. So what the Nazis did is they said, the big bulwark against totalitarian power, the accretion of power into one entity and ultimately one person, is the public-private distinction, which you take as so natural that you don't even question it, right? Well, you can question it, and indeed many feminists question it, and others as well. But push comes to shove, that's one of your best guarantees against elites embedding themselves into power and then transgressing the line that protects you and your island of immunity from power. So the Nazis figured, gotta deconstruct this, right? And so the way you do that is you eliminate the public-private distinction. You say, and Hitler said, everything public is private. and everything private is public. That's why we have a right to insist on behavior that's consistent with loyalty to the system. So, we encourage, we reward wives and husbands who tell on each other, and we encourage and we reward children who squeal on their parents that they said something against Hitler and so on and so forth. So, what they're actually trying to get at in this report is this, that if you intrude too deeply on that private realm, what you're actually doing is you're kicking away one of the last insurance policies you have against totalitarianism. Because if people can congregate privately, reflect on the world privately, they might act differently in the public sphere. But if they lack that capacity, then you've lost any sort of resource to bring resistance to bear against totalitarian power. So what these guys are really, really, really concerned with is stuff that you do every day, right? Which is go on Facebook and immerse yourself in technologies that over time and imperceptibly have push power, persuasive power. They're nudging you towards certain behavior. Of course, what some of the large commercial companies are nudging you toward is to buy the products of services that pay them rewards for selling to them big data about your behavior, okay? So this is a systemic concern. It's no longer the Nazis, it's no longer Hitler, it's really the large IT commercial firms that are actually utterly taking away from our capacity for autonomous thought. And the paradox is we ourselves consider ourselves to be acting wholly autonomously, but in fact we're not. To use the old language of Antonio Gramsci, there's a false consciousness going on here, and in fact you're being duped. Actually, by the way, that's the reason I don't go for any of these supermarket loyalty cards, because you're actually being tracked and your data is being sold once you do. So they're concerned with personality alteration, and again, not just for its own sake. They're linking it to the exigencies of malevolent forces in the political sphere. That if it's possible for you to alter your personality, it ought also be possible for the government or emanations of the government to even unwittingly alter your personalities to make them more amenable to who happens to be in power and who's aspiring to power and so forth. Nanotechnology is the one where they absolutely accentuate the utter unpredictability of how this technology is going to interact with human biology more generally, but also in the atmosphere and out there. Excuse me. And ICT, which brings a lot of this together, is, as I said, worrisome because of its potential to honor you. You think you've been hip with your smartphone, but actually sculpt you, shape you over time. That's their real concern. I know I'm jumping ahead a lot of stuff that they say in there, but I think it's kind of reducible to this. What do they recommend? And I think these recommendations have traction. I think you're going to see action on these recommendations in the next 2 or 3 years. That the bioethics work of the Council of Europe should extend beyond the purely medical and personalized medical field into what's, and this is emerging as a whole field in its own, nano-neuro-info-cognoscience and technology. It'll be the first in the world that actually does that, and I think it will do that. Also, it talks about the regulatory process, and it uses words that's confusing even to Europeans, right? It's using words like governance, hard governance, soft governance, which basically is the regulatory regime, right? Whether the regulatory regime is command style, that is to say the government or some regulatory agency, you must do this, you must not do that, or whether it's more soft style in terms of it's recommended that you do this, that, and the other. The whole tendency in Europe has been towards soft regulation. And that means kind of outsourcing the regulation to the bodies that are actually going to be regulated. Sounds very strange, doesn't it, when you think about it that way. And most of the bodies that regulate these diverse fields in Europe and around the world are the actual research entities themselves. So they come together, they formulate their own ethical standards and so forth. In a sense, what these two consultants are saying is the issues are too important now to be left to soft regulation. There's got to be a lot more input from civil society, from ordinary citizens and so forth. Good luck on that one, because that swims against the tide of regulatory religion in Europe, which is very much pro-market. Thirdly, and I really do think this is going to happen, they're recommending a new treaty, a new thematic treaty in the Council of Europe system on ethics, science and technology. And presumably it would have weasel words and weasel headings in there to allow it to be applied to emerging technologies that we can't even imagine at the moment. If I were a betting man, I would lay 64 million rupees on the fact that there will be a treaty on this within the next 5 or 6 years, and I know they're gearing up for it. They also talk about the Council of Europe providing research assets to domestic implementation bodies to guide their action, to guide their regulatory regimes, and so forth. There's a bit of competition, because not only do we have the Council of Europe based in Strasbourg, we also have the European Union based in Brussels, which are actually much more active on these issues than the Council of Europe, mainly because the research budget of the European Union is something like 68 billion euros over 7 years. 40% of it goes into areas like this. And now increasingly, if you are, for example, a new pharmaceutical company trying to edge in on the territory and you're seeking a large European Union grant, you have to have in your bid, for example, some dimension of ethics, some dimension of legal regulation and so forth. So there's an interesting kind of a tussle going on there between the European Union and the Council of Europe, who work well together mostly, but sometimes they don't. And they're also decoded. What they're saying is we need an advance warning system. We need some way to be able to keep track of, to apprehend, and then put together some sense of what's emerging and where the dangers lie, as well as the possibilities, but also the dangers, particularly the dangers. So it's likely in the next 4 or 5 years we'll have some sort of, what do they call it, not a monitoring body, but a watchdog. The word eludes me for the time being. So these are the European documents, so to speak. Now again, the basic ambiguity, though, is how you read some of these grund norms that are supposed to guide research activity and applications of research. Most of these instruments, like the UNESCO instruments, even the Council of Europe instruments, will announce these and then drop them. They won't actually tell you which way they're spinning them. And that's the crucial issue. Do you read notions of personal privacy and dignity and autonomy wholly individualistically, in which case, for example, it's easy then to accept hook, line and sinker the transhumanist declaration about individuals having an ironclad right to adopt this technology to their own use? Or do you read it the other way around, which is to say that although you are the primary bearer of the right of autonomy, there is a transcendent sense to it such that we collectively are entitled to ensure that your autonomy projects into the future, and therefore there are certain limits on what kind of enhancements that you can undertake for your own sake. So these pillars can go this way or they can go that way. Sorry, I didn't have a graphic that showed the pillars wavering. Maybe I should have done that in whatever the program is. So that's the core conundrum. It's not entirely solved by a precautionary principle. There's some principled elements to this that you have to decide for yourselves. And as I say, the law doesn't drive that judgment. Other things will probably drive that judgment, which may be peculiar to your culture. Okay, I'll come back to this. Well, I suppose yeah, this is the interesting thing about the Council of Europe documentation. Bearing in mind that the prime directive of the Council of Europe is human rights, the rule of law, and democracy, it has a systems concern that goes beyond the individual rights concern. How do I explain that? Once, when I was young and I had black hair instead of this hair, I actually read the travaux preparatoires of the drafting of the European Convention of Human Rights. What's absolutely fascinating about that, by the way, the British were to the fore in drafting the convention as well as some others, and they came to it with a highly pragmatic philosophy about how to populate this new treaty. The treaty was intended as a collective floor, a guarantee that no one of our states would fall beneath it, and of course if they did, that's a slide toward totalitarianism, and that's a slide toward war, and we don't want that ever again on the continent of Europe, although even though we do have it on the edges of Europe at the moment. So that was the uber concern, right? And then when it comes to drafting the convention, in terms of the selection of the rights to put into the convention, it wasn't a philosophical argument about what's close to your dignity, what is the true nature of human nature. No, it was what right do we put in place to forestall the slide toward breaking down the public-private distinction and creating space for totalitarian rule or authoritarian power. So that's why things like liberty, due process, freedom of expression in maintaining circulation of elites in the liberal democracy, throwing the rogues out periodically only for another set of rogues, but so what, at least you think you're getting a fresh start. And there was a huge debate over privacy, because most of the states said, okay, if our litmus test is what rights serve the instrumental purpose of embedding in place a liberal democracy. By the way, they're very conscious of the emergence of people's democracies on the other side of the Iron Curtain, and that was not what they were trying to bring about. Then privacy doesn't fit, doesn't do the job, like freedom of expression or due process and so forth. So two governments came forward with the argument on privacy. One was Belgium and one was Ireland. And that was really coming from Catholic teaching. But when they knew that wouldn't win the game, because not all European countries are Catholic, right? Even we are post-Catholic at this stage. They said, a zone of immunity around the person and those with whom he or she associates is incredibly important, because at the end of the day, that's your last guarantee against totalitarianism. And that's why there's Article 8 in the European Convention. There's no other reason why Article 8 is in there. So right from the get-go, the DNA of the Council of Europe system is we're preserving a system. We honor individual rights largely as instrumental to preserving that system, even though you get the exact opposite impression when you're looking at the case law and so forth. But ultimately, it's the system's interests that predominate. So it's this transcendent idea of the exigencies of a liberal democracy that predominate. Therefore, it's natural for the consultants to fall into assuming that if the exercise of autonomy is such that it might jeopardize the system, there's the dividing line. Okay, so it's pretty obvious they're not approaching this in a deontological fashion. They're not actually honestly unzipping individual rights of autonomy. In fact, they're working from an extraneous vantage point, placing limits on human autonomy. And of course, if you're really committed to the transhumanist declaration, you'll find that absolutely obnoxious, but hey, that's the European way. That's not to say it should be the Indian way, but that's certainly the European way. So it's this interplay between the exigencies of the system, namely an open, tolerant, pluralistic, liberal democracy, and individual rights, that's fascinating in the documentation you've seen. Okay, I want to do something naughty. I want to first of all congratulate each and every single one of you for becoming legal advisor to the Indian Foreign Minister. There's now about 24 legal advisors to the Indian Foreign Ministry. There's a treaty being drafted in the UN system. The government of India charges you with the task of leading the delegation of India in the drafting of a new UN treaty. You'll be doing it in New York, fabulous city. You'll have a great time. And it's going to govern enhancement, personality, emotional alteration, gene editing, machine-human interfaces. So they say to you, look, we take human rights really seriously, but by the way, there's a huge pharma industry here in India and we want to attract more. So what can you do to regularize that? And then it isn't just make in India, it's invent in India and imagine the future in India, right? So you bring together a task force from different ministries, preliminary to going to New York, to set out the key principles. How are you going to understand conceptions of autonomy and privacy? Okay, what spin are you going to put on it? To define the material scope of the treaty, what exactly is it going to be looking at? Define the rights and obligations, and in a way the rights and obligations are a translation of your overall philosophy, your overall take on what is the correct framing of human autonomy and so forth. And then set out your ideas for some oversight mechanism, maybe at a national level and at an international level. We used to have a bioethics, national bioethics committee in Ireland. I'm not sure, do you do here in India? Yes? No? No. Oh yeah, okay, it's part of the ministry. Okay, okay. So I have an even more mischievous exercise for tomorrow. But what I'd like you to do is break into clusters and discuss this and come up with some sort of coherent view. I think the particularly important one here is your key set of principles that will be guiding the drafting of the treaty, so that when you bump up against difficulties, what is it that you're falling back on? Okay? So let's divide up for a while, discuss this, and we'll take it to its next logical step after that. Give you 10